early medieval period in Indian history spans from circa 600 CE to circa 1300 CE, and this period is to be located between the early historic and the medieval. This period signifies changes and continuity in Indian history, and B.D. Chattopadhyay has talked about this period as a much maligned period in Indian history because of the fact that Marxist historians have regarded this period as a breakdown of the civilizational matrix of the society. But we have to remember that the most important debate in Indian history, that is the feudalism debate, centered around this period. So what we find is that the feudalism debate as well as the other kinds of formulations that was actually working within the framework of feudalism was becoming imminent in this period. Another very important point of debate was centered around the structure of the polity. This was because we find that in this period there is multiplicity of powers. We have numerous ruling houses which was different in the early historic period. And although historians agree that there were changes in the structure of the big kingdoms, there is no unanimity on the causative factor of these changes. So we can very well understand that there were different kinds of opinions regarding the changes in the structure of the kingdom. When we look at the Marxist historiography, we find that scholars like R.S. Sharma, B.N.S. Jadhav and the like, they want to put this period within the backdrop of feudalism, and they think that this was because there was decentralization of power and which also led to disintegration. But there were oppositions to this view, and this came first of all in the writings of B.D. Chattopadhyay, where he was trying to show that we should not look at this period against the backdrop of feudal formation. What we should do is, it was not that there was a total change from the matrix of the early historic period. We have to posit this period within three perspectives. Number one, that there was local level state formation. Number two, we have seen that there was the structure of the Varna and Jati. So we have Jati, proliferation of Jatis in this period, and then thirdly, it was the acculturation of the tribes into the mainstream Brahmanical mode of religion.
Is there any relation between Indian feudalism and European feudalism?
Yes, of course, there is much relation because the moorings of the Indian feudalism was brought from the ideas that were persistent in the historiography of Europe. R.S. Sharma and others borrowed the ideas of Henri Pirenne and Marc Bloch from the European concept of feudalism and then put it lock, stock and barrel into the Indian scenario. What we find is that in the Indian feudalism, R.S. Sharma sought to see it in the whole process of the land grant economy. There was a time when we find that the rulers were granting lands to the Brahmanas as well as to the monasteries and the other religious institutions, for example, a Brahmanical Matha or a Jaina Vasadi. So these granting of lands were actually rent-free lands, which is known as the Agrahara system in Indian economy. So when this rent-free land was given and there were some sort of judicial rights were also given to these donis, so the Marxist historiography looks at it as the diminishing of the rights of the rulers. So the idea of the coercive power of the ruler, that is dando, is not there anymore in the hands of the monarchs. So there it is seen that there is a total breakdown. The next step which the Marxist historiography looks at is that they look at this entire process as a lord-vassal relationship. But we have to remember that this looking at the Indian feudalism in the context of lord and vassal was first started in the historiography by Colonel James Todd. When he was working on Rajasthan in 19th century, what he saw is that he saw a replication of the European lord-vassal relationship, where the vassal supplies the lord with enough army and other sort of helps, and in return the lord gives him protection. So this relation, and there was also a sense of loyalty from the part of the vassal to the lord. So what happened is that this whole system of this lord-vassal relationship was seen by Todd as a replication of the feudalism which was prevalent in Europe. The second point in Indian feudalism came when D.D. Kosambi wrote his famous book, An Introduction to Indian History, and there he tried to posit feudalism from above and feudalism from below. It means that when the ruler grants an amount of land to a Brahmin or to a religious institution, so he is creating a landed intermediary, and so it is the feudalism from above. And the next step, the feudalism from below, meant that there were local level persons, the village level, they were important persons who rose to the standard of the lord from below. So it was the feudalism from below. For R.S. Sharma, actually the whole breakdown took place in the context of the social crisis. The king was not exercising enough power because a kind of landed intermediary was created between the king and the actual peasantry. Second thing, what R.S. Sharma visualized was that gradually lands were being also given not only to the religious donis but also to the secular donis. And secular donis were getting land. Why? Because according to him, the state was not in possession of enough currency. And so in lieu of money, in lieu of salaries, these secular people who were in service to the king, who were working for the king, they were being given lands. But the point is, R.S. Sharma does not go much into the decline of the feudalism, the concept of feudalism in India. Next, the question comes is, are we to believe that this formulation of Indian feudalism, was it accepted by everybody? Naturally not, because the whole feudalism thesis was based on the land grant economy, and it has been said that between the land grant economy and expansion of state and all, there is a kind of contrast, and so all these things led to the decline of trade, urbanization and all this. It was D.C. Sharkar who first, among the non-Marxist historians, who first opposed R.S. Sharma's feudalism thesis, and he said that the proponents of feudalism are actually confusing landlordism and overlordism with feudalism. Way back in 1979, Harbans Mukhia questioned the entire formulation, both empirically and theoretically, of Indian feudalism. And he looked at it not only from the economic perspective, but he looked at it also from the ecological perspective. After Harbans Mukhia, there were other historians also who challenged the views of the Marxist historiography. In the context of trade and urbanization, there were some sort of theories which were being questioned. But before I come to trade and urbanization, let me go to the social perspective. R.S. Sharma himself talks about that feudalism thesis is to be looked at from the cultural matrix also. After that, D.N. Jha, in his latest book, The Feudal Order, posted articles which are much related to the cultural milieu under feudalism in India.
Ma'am, did the historians criticize the notion of the decline of trade and urban centers?
They did criticize, and it's the right point that you have taken up. We have a number of historians actually who have criticized the concept of decline of trade and the concept of deurbanization. What I would like to point out here for you is that when we look at these theses of that there was a decline of long distance trade, we find that even D.N. Jha, who supports the feudalism thesis, he questions R.S. Sharma's view on long distance trade. He says that long distance trade should not be taken as a marker for decline of the economic, for a change in the economic scenario on early medieval India. But the historians who actually took up the case against deurbanization, against decline, are two historians. One is B.D. Chattopadhyaya and the second is Ranavir Chakravarti. B.D. Chattopadhyaya, with his strong empirical models, showed that there were no deurbanization in this period, and he was talking about a phase where we can say that it is third urbanization. Ranavir Chakravarti, on the other hand, what he did is that he showed us that we have different categories of merchants, we have different categories of markets, as well as we have different categories of different types of trade networks moving around at this point of time. So the whole question of decline of trade, deurbanization, does not exist at all. Finally, regarding the monetary anemia thesis, which is very much a part of the feudalism debate, this thesis has also been questioned by B.D. Chattopadhyaya, B.N. Mukherjee and John S. Dale, and they find that lack of currency in this period does not stand good in history. Now we shall discuss the nature of the polity in early medieval period. I've already told you that there were multiplicity of kingdoms in this period, and all these kingdoms have been studied by different historians, and they have tried to understand that what kind of structure of polity these kingdoms belong to. So we have a scenario in North India, we have a scenario in South India, and naturally whatever the kind of polity that was structured in the case of North India was different from that of South India. So overall, the whole Indian scenario has been structured into three models. So we have, for the first thing, we have the model of a centralized monarchical system, where we find the king, the monarch, holds the power along with the centralized bureaucracy. For example, we had this in the case of the Mauryas. Secondly, we have the fragmented polity as envisaged by the feudalism proponents. So we have the centralized monarchy, we have feudalism, that is a fragmented or decentralized monarchical system of state, and then finally we have a model where we find that the state has not reached the centralized system, but there is a kind of centralized pattern in it, and which revolves around the capital.
Ma'am, what worked towards this administrative decentralization?
For this administrative decentralization, we have two processes. Number one was the practice of making land grants, and which led to the lack of administrative privileges on the part of the ruler. And secondly, the ruler lost its control over the army. So this entire thing was looked upon as the diminishing power of the ruler, and so he naturally did not have his coercive authority. This was again situated in the backdrop of the Puranas, where we find that there was a deep-seated social crisis, and this deep-seated social crisis, the loss of the Varnasrama Dharma, this was all situated or all located because of the lack of power of the king or lack of use of dando by the king.
Ma'am, what is the hallmark of early medieval polity?
Oh yeah, the hallmark of early medieval polity can be seen in the Samanto system. Now, who is a Samanto? It has been equated with a feudal lord in the context of Europe, but you know, in the Indian context, the Samanto is a little different from the feudal lord. we find that in the Arthashastra, Shamanta was originally a neighboring king. But gradually there was a change in the perception of a Shamanto, and we find that different hierarchies among the Shamantas, and we have the Loghu Shamanto or a Mahamandaleshwara, Mandaleshwara, like that. Even in the Harshacharita, if you look, then you'll find different grades of Shamantas. So when you have this hierarchy, this leads to the thing that there were a hierarchy in the vassal, and these Shamantas actually helped in the rise of this political system, and they were giving help to the rulers when they were in dearth of army. As I said, that there was the rulers had some problem over the control of the army. So here we find that the Shamantas had their own armies, and they sometimes, when required, they provided army to the rulers. So this Shamanta system has been looked at from different angles by the historians. So this is a very important part of early medieval polity. Now, coming back to the idea of a centralized polity, we find that this kind of centralized polity did not have much of its supporter among the historians. They don't talk much about the centralized polity that existed in the early medieval period. What we find is that we have a kind of polity, and according to some historians, that here there were some integrative processes were at work, where the state society expanded, and the societies which were at the periphery, they were integrated into the mainstream state society. And as for the feudalism thesis, the feudal polity or the structure of feudalism, we find that they are more restricted to the North Indian scenario. But Bidip Chattopadhyay would like to see that this kind of integration or integrative polity could be noticed in North India, in many parts of Central India, and also in South India. So the whole concept of feudalism thesis being for the entire Indian scenario is perhaps not correct.
Ma'am, what about South Indian polity? Like, was it any different?
South Indian polity, yes. South Indian polity has been given a different kind of treatment, and when we are talking of South India, actually for the historians, they mostly talk about the Chola polity. You all know about the Chola monarchs, Rajaraja, Rajendra. They are all great monarchs who have been eulogized in history like anything. So when we are coming to the Chola regime, we find that the kind of polity that was in practice during the time of the Cholas were different from that of which we find in North India. And that is because here, both in the Pallava times and in the Chola times, we have very strong local bodies. When we look at the centralized polity, we find that this sort of local bodies at the village level is not encouraged in centralized polity. Whereas in the Chola period, we find that we have village level bodies which were very much active. Bertenstein posited the Chola polity, or rather he began with the Pallavas and he extended his idea of the structure of polity in South India till very late, even beyond the Vijayanagar period. For him, this was a segmented kind of polity. The East African Alur society acted as a model for Bertenstein. Now, according to Bertenstein, the Chola's kingdom was divided into certain segments, and in these segments you have the ruler who is the primary, who has the primacy of everything, of ritual control, but the entire segments were independent and they had their own kind of administration, and each segment was not responsible to the other segment nor to the rulers. So he differentiated between the actual political control and ritual sovereignty, and for him the main ritualist was the Chola ruler. So when we differentiate between actual political control and ritual sovereignty, we find that the Chola monarch is relegated in the background. He doesn't have the kind of control that he should have over the other segments of his territory. This concept of ritual sovereignty has been questioned by another German historian, Hermann Kuhlke. According to Kuhlke, what we find is that ritual sovereignty should not be confused as lack of sovereignty. He said that in a country like India, in a traditional country, ritual is a very important part of our tradition. So it is actually ritual sovereignty is a pacemaker of power. Secondly, when the monarch made this temple, this Rajrajeshwara temple, which was built by Chola monarch Rajendra Chola. So we have that this Rajrajeshwara temple in Tanjavur, that is modern Tanjore, it was reflecting the power and glory of the Cholas. For the proponent of the segmentary state, that is for Bartenstein, this was actually a symbol showing that the lack of power of the Chola monarch. He did not think that the Chola monarch was very powerful and therefore he was building this temple. And taking cue from this, we have another historian, George Spencer, who actually talks about the Chola raids in Southeast Asia as a politics of plunder. For him, this plunder, these raids, this Chola control over Southeast Asian countries, these were actually with a plunder motive and not otherwise. So these things have been challenged by historians. Next we find that when we are talking about this segmentary state theory, here also B.D. Chattopadhyay has a kind of opinion to offer. For him, it is not a kind of structure that should be equated to the Indian scenario. And when we are talking of fragmented polity, it is true that there was, after the fall of the Guptas, there was fragmentation. We have small principalities, and these fragmented principalities, they were becoming powerful, so they were independent entities. But what happened is that these fragmented these polities, they were fragmented because they were having their independent status. But it doesn't seem that the power of the ruler was fragmented. They were becoming an independent scenario, independent entity in their own right. So we should not look at this kind of things from the point of view of fragmentation as the feudalist has seen this kind of polity.
Ma'am, in this context, what is the stand of the non-aligned historians?
This non-aligned historian, group of non-aligned historians was formed by, or I should use the term, it was termed by Hermann Kulke, when he said that the historians who do not go by the feudalism thesis or do not go by the segmentary thesis, they should form a separate group, and he calls them the non-aligned group of historians because they are not posited in the either side of the pole. So this non-aligned group of historians, they are in favor of integrative polity. When I began, I was talking of integrative polity, which was propounded at one point of time by B.D. Chattopadhyay. Hermann Kulke also believes that it was a kind of, in India, we have a kind of integrative polity where we find that the state societies, the regional local formations were merging into the larger monarchical formations. So we have the constantly the moving of the periphery groups, the tribals, the autochthonous groups moving into the larger scenario of monarchical polity. So there was no kind of disintegration, there was no kind of fragmentation and no kind of segmentation. It was a kind of integration. So finally you should remember that it is a kind of polity which is being advocated by most of the historians now, that where we have a kind of integration of the state societies, integration of the local level formations. This early medieval period can boast of two debates. One is the feudalism debate and the other is the debate that centers around the political structure. And here we find, regarding the political structure, it is important to note that we had three kind of formulations. One was the centralized formulation, centralized monarchical formulation. Second was the formulation of the fragmented formulation, fragmented state system, and the third is the segmentary state system. But apart from these three formulation, we have a fourth kind of formulation which is termed as the formulation of the non-aligned historians, and which talks about the integrative polity. And thus we find that the integrative polity is now the hallmark of early medieval polity.